Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. During the season, we examine the path to crowning an ultimate college football survivor in the playoff race. But in the offseason, we broaden our topics a bit. As we're recording this, there are meetings happening on the future of college football playoff and what it might look like after the next two seasons of 12 teams are finished. So today, we're going to take a look at the way power is shifted to seemingly consolidate the haves from the have-nots and whether it's something that should be mourned, celebrated, or perhaps somewhere in between, or put another way, why would we even try to stop these changes? But before we get to that, first of all, you can always find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights, run polls, and listen to your feedback. We're a podcast, so if you can, take a second to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. But all of that said, as I mentioned, we're in between a couple of days of meetings that are going on right now with the stakeholders, or say the conferences, in the college football playoff. Yesterday, because we're recording this right now on a Wednesday, on Tuesday, the story was that they are officially going to shift the playoff from what was called a 6+6 model to a 5+7 model. Now, Shehan, I'll let you kind of take us through that. What does that mean?
So previously, for people who didn't know, there were 6 guaranteed spots for conference champions, and that was, in theory, made for 5 Power 5 teams and 1 Group of 5 team. So what it did is it guaranteed a spot for the Group of 5. Now, it didn't mandate that the 5 spots went to Power 5 teams. Technically, in 2020, the conference champion from the Pac-12 actually would not have been among the 6 top champions, and there would have been 2 Group of 5 champions, but obviously that was kind of a weird year. But ultimately, there was a reserve spot. Now, with the collapse of the Pac-12, now it's the Pac-2, the Pac-2 champion between Oregon State and Washington State is not going to be eligible for any of those conference champion spots. So they made an agreement that they were going to go in and change it from 6 to 5. So again, in theory, it's 4 power conference champions plus 1 Group of 5 champion. It guarantees, it's a stone cold lock. Every single year there will be a Group of 5 team. It does, again, similar deal. If there are 2 Group of 5 teams in the top 5 conference champions, then potentially a power team could still be left out. But especially with the way that conference championship games are changing, that's going to be pretty unlikely, just because you're going to have 1v2 instead of like, hey, number 23 Iowa is playing against number 1 Michigan, and if they pull an upset, maybe the Big Ten will get left out of the top 4. That's very unlikely to happen now. But what it does mean is again, the Pac-12, for all intents and purposes, who, by the way, made a commissioner change that will be effective in about 9 days from the time that you're listening to this. But that conference is not going to be considered a conference for the purposes of choosing a college football playoff field. And ultimately, the format still remains the same. The top 4 conference champions in the rankings are going to be able to stay put and get a bye in the first round. And then the 5th conference champion will be ranked along with the 5 through 12. So why did this happen? I think that this is a question that a lot of people have. Because the Group of 5 could have held firm. It took a unanimous vote to change from a 6+6 to a 5+7. But the reason that the Group of 5 opted to do this is because in 2025, the college football playoff contract officially expires. And what that means is that there is no format in place heading forward. Not a 4-team, not a 12-team, nothing. And so what could happen is, yes, maybe you could have the 6+6 that's been approved, been worked on, and have 2 Group of 5 teams guaranteed every single year for the next 2 years. But starting in 2026, you could end up in a situation where the power conferences ultimately remake the playoff in their image and leave the Group of 5 out. So this is giving a concession now to try and set up a long-term commitment to this model, that there will long-term be a 5+7 model. So again, There's a lot of people who wanted it to stay at 6+6, but the conference commissioners in the group of five ultimately came to a decision that they were all going to vote for the change to the 5+7. And certainly there would be concessions involved that would be a little more attractive to them so that we could get this format in time for the 2024 college football season.
One thing that was also kind of fun to see in play, at least in this initial vote, was Washington State, even though the Pac-12 was no longer able to have a conference champion participate outside of being in that large team, they also had to get a vote as well. So, again, it's been interesting. I don't think we'll have the details yet. Nothing's been leaked so far, but it sounds like they are getting some financial compensation to Oregon State and Washington State to kind of go along with all of this, because they could have also been an interesting stumbling block. Even though they couldn't qualify for a team, it sounds like they could have still been disruptive. And maybe they still can be disruptive. I think that they're also playing that game because there's a lot of fans, a lot of, I think, even very openly rooting interests in some corners of the press to see the Pac-2 kind of take their revenge on everybody. But in 2 years' time, as you said, because after the next two playoffs, this upcoming 12-team and the following year's 12-team playoff, Oregon State and Washington State could burn so many bridges if they're not careful that people are like, well, you guys, sorry, you can't participate at all. And they are being realistic. So I think also, to be fair, a lot of the things that these entities are saying in public, it's a part of the game of brinksmanship. It's part of a negotiation. We see it in every aspect of life, in criminal trials and criminal or in any kind of business negotiations. If they're in any way public, people will start making pronouncements that sound to be extreme, and get cheers from certain quarters. But at the end of the day, usually you end up somewhere in the middle. And it was quite a smooth. I admit, yesterday went smoother than even I expected. I thought we might hear a little bit of rumbling, but it was like it just seemed like, oh no, everyone came to an agreement, everyone's fine. And then, of course, the post decision, as soon as the CFP's official announcement came out, some of these quotes coming out of it were like, oh no, we were all on the same page. Or the Wazoo president or whatever it was, like, we weren't going to challenge this at all, wink. And then you hear, and they got a couple of $1 million for their trouble. I mean, probably more than a couple $1 million. It sounds like Dr. Evil in the original Austin Powers, like $1 million means something in this day and age. But it's been interesting to see that. I'm very curious, though, to find out, because the next step that is going to be, what does the playoff look in the future? And with this new, I forgot how they're calling it, the Big Ten SEC partnership, strategic alliance. I know they're not using alliance. I forgot what they're exactly calling it, but if they're not happy with the way this
definitely not alliance.
Yeah, but if they're not happy with how this is looking in a couple of years, with the way it's negotiating, they could create their own rival and presumably, hopefully, invite the other conferences to come join them, all of the conferences, hopefully. But at the same time, that's a play in it. I mean, we've been seeing rumors that both of those conferences are requesting 4 automatic qualifiers, so like their top 4 teams might end up in the playoff. The interesting counterpoint to that, because people then keep talking about it as though that means there's going to be 12 teams in the far future. It could be that we see an interesting negotiation point, and I know you're familiar with this, that they could end up with, say, 16 teams. And so 4 of those, or let's say half of those, go to these 2 super conferences, with the rest divided among the I don't know what we even call them anymore. Is it the SEC, Big Ten, and the Seven Dwarves? I don't know. Like, is it? How do we even look at it now? We've got these 2 super conferences, and just the rest of you can figure out. It would be funny if it just as the rest of you figure it out as you so choose. Just make sure there's a bunch of at-large bids that we can also win. But I'm curious to see how that pans out.
The way that I feel like I've heard it so far is we have the Power 2, the Mid 2, and then the Group of 5. I think that's kind of right now where we're at. We'll kind of see where it ends up over the next couple of years. Ultimately, I will say this. Like you said, there's been some reporting that the SEC and Big Ten are pushing for their top 4 teams to get in. And I get it. I understand why they're doing all this. To me, that is so loser. Like, to say, well, we should have 4 guaranteed, no matter what. Have you seen the top of the Big Ten at times? Like, there are not 4 good teams. And adding USC, adding Oregon, Washington, there will probably be 4 good teams most of the time. I expect in this new system, the way that I have it kind of in my head is, okay, we're going to have probably 4 from the Big Ten, 4 from the SEC almost every year. You have a guaranteed 3 other conference champions. That's going to take us to 11. And then I think that one of the ACC or the Big 12, sorry, is going to get another spot. And I think that pretty much covers us from where that is. I think that's what it's going to be most years. But to try and guarantee yourself a spot is such loser behavior to me. Like, the idea that it's like, well, I mean, Ole Miss got 4th in the SEC. They should be in, even though that they might have been the 21st team in the country. Like, what are we doing here? If you are advantaging yourself in so many ways against everybody else, so if you can't put 4 teams into the top 12 in the country, then that is solely on you. Don't sit here and try to say we should be guaranteed this right if you don't trust that your conference can produce 4 good teams, which they should be able to do. So again, to me, that is loser behavior. That is like, I think that when we get to the point of saying our 3rd and 4th place team are guaranteed an auto bid to the college football playoff, that's when I think we're just playing in a kangaroo court in a Mickey Mouse sort of tournament.
Yeah, we certainly haven't seen that level of separation. I've only seen something like this work where, again, we're talking international college football. I'm not going to drag us into the weeds, where there were literally 2 conferences and then the rest of the country. And they were, for a while, it would always end up being a playoff with those 2 big conferences. So finally they expanded their playoff and let the top couple of teams out of those 2, but we are not at that level. I mean, the Big Ten and SEC can brag all they want, but they're not that level yet. The rest of the conferences can certainly compete with them. Especially the mid 2, or however we're going to call them, the bigger of the dwarfs. They can still compete. And that kind of brings, and it's an interesting question too, because I agree that the idea, I can see the counter argument. I just want to see that. I can say that with the sheer number of teams in these 2 conferences, dividing up the money that they get for allowing teams in is something they would rather guarantee. But if we're talking the way the market should kind of work in a lot of ways, if they are that good, as you said, they should be able to battle their way in. And I think that's a pretty defensible position, and it's one that I would back as well. It kind of brings us into the conversation we wanted to have, which is, for all of this consolidation, for all of this talk of what's the future of college football with all the money involved and how the rich seem to get richer, the powers, the split between the haves and the have-nots appears to be deepening. What does that mean for the sport? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? I don't know, or is it somewhere in between? I've heard so much conversation, and I'm going to admit freely, this is an idea I had. I wanted to have this conversation because I've been hearing so much conversation about people wringing their hands. It's like it's a and part of it is just the nature of, I think, sports media. People, I mean, for generations, I'm talking your grandparents reading the sports paper would have had the local columnist decrying something or other. That's just the nature of the beast. But honestly, listening to some of this stuff, I just the other day, it hit me. I don't get it some of the time. I mean, for all the frustration that, and a lot of this started with the NCAA and what it is and what it's done, people now don't like the alternative. And part of me is like, did you not see what the alternative was going to be? And, I'm sure the people listening to this know what we're talking about, but, a lot of the frustration came from all the money that was coming in. Like, oh my goodness, all these teams are getting so rich from these TV contracts, and the players still get nothing. And, there are all those classic moments of so-called amateurism ruining, careers, or at least derailing them. You could go back to Jim Thorpe and his attempts to be in the Olympics and having his medals taken away, or Jeremy Bloom, the Colorado skier who couldn't play football because of his skiing agreements, or more recently UCF with Donald Delahaye and his YouTube channel. I mean, I was also thinking, and it's so funny because if the story was great at the time, and it's funny to look back on it, but it's also kind of a silly story. But Brian Bosworth in the 1980s infamously was at the 1987 Orange Bowl, and He was not allowed to play in it for steroid use. So I want to be clear, he wasn't upset about not being paid. But
what, the boss use steroids? That's crazy.
Yeah, he pulled off his shirt, his jersey, and he had that shirt underneath that was First of all, from a design perspective, I was a little bit like, I like design. It kind of bugged me to see it because it's a very poorly designed shirt, but he made it himself. National communists against athletes, that was really, I mean, for decades, this kind of this annoyance with how it was. And we were watching a slow evolution, but as time and as we look back, it wasn't like a scale that was moving up slowly. It was an exponential scale, it feels like it gradually rose. And then in the last however many years, it accelerated. Because in 1984, TV money was opened up. That really started to allow the programs to pull in TV deals that brought in significant amounts of money. And, the NCAA famously had their wrist slapped back in 95 that they couldn't restrict coaching salaries. So that opened up the real can of worms for some of the salaries that were being decried when talking about the players. And then it's actually amazing. This is a product of my age, but time has passed where in the last 15 years, we've seen these cases from O'Bannon to Alston kind of push us into a realm where players can be compensated just short of being an employee. And with people cheering all of it, the only resistance it seemed to be from administrators at schools in the NCAA. Now, seeing where we're headed, we have this all like, oh, but no, we don't want all of these things happening. It's getting too rich. And I think that's something I wanted to try and get to the bottom of, because I don't know, what's your position on this, Sean? Do you think we're getting too far in this? Is the sport getting too focused on money?
Yeah, I think to me, there is no question about it. I think that when you look at every decision and every bad decision that's been made over the last 50 years, but especially the last 5 to 10 years, all of them are in the pursuit of money. And I want to be clear, I don't think it's just about the money. It's about what the money says about you. Because I hear from so many people, well, how are we supposed to have these sports? How are we supposed to support Well, I don't know, man. My local high school supports volleyball. Somehow they managed to do it. Somehow they managed to make it happen. But I do think that ultimately, it's a fear of loss. It's a fear of falling behind. You see LSU open up this giant, beautiful new weight room, even though they lifted perfectly fine weights beforehand. You see all of a sudden, these rumors over the past couple of days that the SEC and the Big Ten want more money from the college football playoff contract because they're the SEC and the Big Ten, so they should get a bigger share than the Big 12 and the ACC because, we can't fall behind, but we can't lose this money. And I think ultimately, we've seen such a focus from the SEC especially on money. And I think that actually, in a lot of ways, that's been a killer for some of these programs because there's an obsession with we have to pay the most, we have to throw money at good coaches in our mind, we have to rush to extend our coaches, we have to give Jimbo Fisher a 10-year, $95 million contract because otherwise he's going to look at LSU and Texas A&M will collapse as a university if Jimbo Fisher leaves for LSU and doesn't cost us any money. We have to pay $76 million to prove that we can make him go away. And so ultimately, it just becomes a statement so much about what you can accomplish off the field, whether it's in coaching salaries, whether it's in facilities, whether it's in conference affiliation, whether it's in recruiting. I mean, Georgia has a recruiting budget that's like $1 million more than anybody else in the entire country. And I think that in a hilarious way, we stopped focusing on the football. There's so much good stuff happening on the football field in college football. And, I've talked to people before and, we're really in agreement. The greatest cure to worrying about all of these external factors is to attend a football game. Because ultimately, when you go to a football game, whether it's an Alabama game, whether it's the national title game, which I was at this year, or whether it's going down and seeing, UTSA play and packing a place, or whether it's going and seeing, I have all these Texas teams in mind because obviously I do. But if going to see Sam Houston, or whether it's going to see, Iowa State pack a place, Kansas State pack a place. That is the greatest cure to all of this because it should be about the football. And I think the other thing that's happened too, and this is kind of hilarious. It's a negative externality that I don't think people really expected. Was starting in 1998, we had a unified national champion. Now, there were exceptions, but for all intents and purposes, we had a real national champion. That had never happened in the history of the sport. The AP national champion was considered to be kind of the real national champion, but there were very legitimate cases made by coaches poll, by, any other number of selectors over the years. Well, in 1998, suddenly winning a national championship was a solitary goal. And I think that we have seen we talk about rings culture. We talk about it a lot in basketball and the NBA, but I think that that's driven a lot of it. It's not just enough to have good seasons, to win conference championships, to have a chance at winning a national championship. It's if we did not win the national championship, then we are failures and nothing matters. I actually saw Stephen A. Smith actually had a rant earlier where he was like, Notre Dame's irrelevant. What have they even done lately? And the answer is like, they are one of 8 teams that have made the college football playoff. They multiple times in the college football playoff era. They've won like 75% of their games over the last 10 years. When they joined a conference for 1 year, they won the dang conference, by the way. And people are like, well, but they went to the playoff and they lost. And if the only thing that people can judge themselves on is, well, Michigan won the title this year and I didn't, I'm sad and mad and this is not good enough, well then I'm sorry, like this sport is doomed, because this is not a sport that's built for there to only be one achievable goal. So I think that so much of this panic over money comes back to the fact that only one team can win the national championship, and ultimately for so many programs, ones who have no business thinking that they can win a national championship, by the way, they believe that all that matters is that one thing. And if you are not moving forward, you are falling behind. And so we don't care what happens to tradition. We don't care. I mean, we are... Think of the Pac-12, right? We're in this situation where these schools that have been tied for years and years and years, Oregon State, Washington State, Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA, Stanford, Cal, like these teams have played each other for 100 years. These fan bases have rivalries. These fans care about these games. But the only thing that matters is the almighty dollar. So USC is going to go play in Piscataway, freaking New Jersey, because they can't afford to fall behind the rest of college football when you're supposed to be USC. Look in the mirror. Go out and fundraise, recruit some players who can play defense, and get the hell over yourself. It's not about the money. Just go and win.
It's so funny because it made me think of one era that, or at least one moment that gets forgotten, is when Notre Dame suddenly unilaterally decided some of its rivalries weren't important enough to keep going. So suddenly their annual rivalry with Michigan State went away. Their annual rivalry, I think it was Purdue, went away. Because they wanted to make that arrangement with the ACC. So we've seen it happen even not that long ago, but long enough ago that honestly it never comes up anymore when people talk about some of these decisions to kind of put rivalries aside for the sake of money and kind of the future. One of the things that has kind of, we're in a situation where I'm not sure how to resolve it, because I think as much as we want to say it's not about money, money is absolutely the motivating factor in all of this. And I want to be clear, it's not just sports. Universities are in an arms race against each other to have the best dorms, to have the best programs. I'm going to be honest, cafeteria food at schools has gotten way better than when I was in college. And I know even when I went, people were telling us that, wow, these are glamorous dorm restaurants compared to when we were in kids. The universities have started to really look at even the regular students as customers, which I think is wonderful, by the way. But all of that said, so even the so-called, they're all nonprofits. Even these athletic departments are nonprofits. So they have to figure out ways to pour the profits they get in back into them. But it's still a race to pull in as much money as possible. And really with sports, and it seemed like it was unlimited, but I think even college football has slowly come to the conclusion that there is actually a finite pool of money out there for them. Because we've sort of seen that. ESPN hasn't 100% confirmed the way they're going to be funding but it sounds like they're going to be the tie-in for whatever the playoff is going to be in the future. The playoff was hoping for more bids, it sounds like. We're still not entirely sure, but from all the reporting, it wasn't a total disappointment, but the money that they got was not the money that they thought they could get. And certainly we had that happen over the summer with the Pac-12, where they really found out the amount of money that was out there wasn't necessarily what they're looking for. I think we're in this awkward time with cable, terrestrial cable, landline cable, however you want to look at it, is receding, and the streaming services are coming on, and will they be able to match that level of money? I bring it up because this competition to be in these conferences that are the ones that are still getting paid is, I think, what we're seeing right now. So it's a competition for a finite pool, not just, the talent, but the available funds. And these super conferences, to an extent, feel a bit like a natural result of it. At the same time, there is a little bit of the flip side of it is, even, gosh, 20 years ago, when there may be like not even 120 teams, maybe 121 college football programs, people would always say, like, there's too many college football programs. You've kind of hinted at it. There's programs where you're like, they're never going to get a shot to win a national championship. They're just going to go have a nice season, maybe win the conference and go to a nice bowl game. That was always kind of the approach, because the BCS certainly had its flaws. Each year they tried to tweak it, and they still couldn't make it so that any Group of Five team ever had a realistic shot of making the national championship game. The CFP was created to not quite as broad as some people were hoping, but it was kind of a negotiation with those that didn't want any change to those that were willing to accept 4 teams. And in 10 years, we did get one G5 program that's now in the Big 12. With this, oddly enough, with this 12-team playoff, we've actually finally reached the point where there is a guaranteed spot for somebody in the G5 to make that shot. Because historically, Akron, and I tend to use Akron, we'll just say it's because they're the first in the alphabet in my mind, they just never had a shot. They realistically have never had a shot to make the college football national championship. Now, as low odds as there are, they're better than ever, because they could theoretically win the MAC, be the top G5 program, and make it in. But all of that said, this kind of goes to what you mentioned. Why are these teams still chasing after this? It's a peer pressure nature. It's like people in the MAC, teams in the MAC, teams in I'm not going to just pick on the MAC, but in the G5 that realistically have probably very little chance, are spending money on building facilities that will somehow never compete with the P5. They're paying coaching salaries for folks who come in and they're still, dealing with the same circumstances, because everyone's racing to the top. It's not like USC and Michigan are staying stagnant. It's not like Alabama isn't growing their program every year and coming up with brand new ways to raise the bar, or Georgia at this point. This is probably the team we should be pointing to. There is this forcing those teams to finally come to terms with the fact that, was Idaho right? Should there be a decision for more teams to just finally let go of this rat race and move back down? Are we seeing kind of this situation where teams have felt obligated to stay up? Is this are we reaching a moment where we see a necessary shakeout of programs that perhaps should not be on the highest level and could perhaps create a better form of football for their fans if they were just to kind of adapt to the level they're at now?
No, I think it's a fair question. And that's one thing that I do like about the proposal by NCAA President Charlie Baker, is that I do ultimately feel like these decisions should be voluntary.
Wait, just to clarify, you're talking about creating a new like level for just the football
a subdivision within that, right? And to for people who don't know about this proposal, Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts, now president of the NCAA, put out a proposal essentially that would ask programs to fund a certain number of their athletes, not just football athletes, but athletes, men and women across the university. It's like 60% that they have to fund. Give them like a base that's more than $30,000 a year, I want to say it was, across their entire collegiate careers. And it can be more than that, but like there just has to be a base salary. But you don't have to do it. But if you do it, you can opt into essentially a different classification. And with that classification, which again is voluntary, anybody can jump into it if they want to. If Akron wants to find money to fund a certain number of their athletes in their sports, they can do it. But what it ultimately means is that it's voluntary. It proves that a school who is willing to commit to it is able to do it and is able to play at that level. And that group will be able to make rules for itself. And so just for a comparison, the 5 Power 5 conferences, now there's 4 obviously, they have had a sort of legal umbrella called being autonomy conferences. And so what that means is that those 5 conferences technically could make rules for themselves that did not have to apply to the rest of FBS or Division 1. Now, they almost never did that. It really never came up, but it was a status that they enjoyed that they kind of held over the rest of the conferences as well. So this would be an opt-in sort of situation. And what it would mean, I think, is it would say if you want to be part of this top level, then you have the opportunity and ability to do that. I would expect every single member of the SEC and the Big Ten, whether they want to or not, will be pushed into this. I think that, does Indiana football, does Vanderbilt football want to have to pay for all of this? Well, it sucks. If you want to be a member of this conference, then you have to do it. I think that is absolutely going to happen. I think the vast majority, if not all of the Big 12 will do it. I think the vast majority probably, I think there are 14 teams in the ACC. I would say 11 plus would probably end up doing that. But it also gives the opportunity for teams that are in the group of 5 right now that potentially have the ability to compete at a higher level. I'm thinking of a program like Boise State. I'm thinking of a program like Memphis.
Liberty would happily pay whatever it takes.
Exactly. There are opportunities for other schools to also be part of this kind of upper status. And so it would be less tied to just what conference you ended up in and more about proving your commitment to doing the thing. And so I think that would actually end up being a good thing. Where I run into frustration, and it is important context as we have this conversation. Like, I went to Baylor, you went to USC. This obviously shapes the way that we see the sport in a lot of ways, because we experienced it in school in a different kind of way. You experienced it from the perspective of ultimately seeing a team become a national championship contender out of blue blood, all this sort of stuff. And I viewed it as like, wow, Baylor did some stuff when I was there that was really cool that people cared about, and that was enough, right? Like, they didn't have to win the national championship for it to be a great run. And I see so many programs. Again, I've been around the Big 12 for a long time, but I also do a lot of Pac-12 coverage. I do a lot of Group of 5 coverage. Like, there is a lot of ways to have success within this system, right? Within the way that the system exists. And I look at a school like SMU. SMU is going to have the opportunity to make the college football playoff. Maybe they'll win a game. And that is a successful season at SMU. It does not have to be more than that. And so ultimately, I'm rambling a little bit. I'm getting a little off topic, but I think that ultimately, when the decisions can be made by the schools, I think that this is a different situation. And I'm hoping that something like that can slow down this rat race. That ultimately, when you are able to opt into the club, that hopefully it gives you some ability to be part of the club. But I do think, again, like I look at the amount of money that's being paid out in the Big Ten and the SEC at this point, and almost all of it is just going to coaches' salaries because they have nothing better to spend it on because they can't directly compensate their players from their athletic department funds. So all of a sudden, you've got, and Steve Sarkisian obviously led his team to the playoff. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve this contract, but he's going from 5.5 to 10.5 million. In that 5 million, that's just one dude's salary bump. He could pay his entire the entire scholarship roster at the University of Texas about $60,000 a year. That's just within his raise. So
Wow.
look, I think that ultimately I understand the obsession with money and I understand not wanting to fall behind, but we are in a position right now where like the games don't actually matter, where TCU made the national championship game last year. And in 2024, people are going to say that where they play doesn't even matter. How do we have a system that so devalues the actual games that are played on the field? And ultimately, how is that palatable? Because I think that when you talk about college football, it is so integral that people have entry points everywhere. They don't just turn on their TV as a kid necessarily and say, oh, well, Alabama's the red team. I like them, even though I live in, Bend, Oregon. That's not really how it works. For most people, their entry to college football is either a team geographically close to them where people are fans and it's a communal experience, or it's that you that you enroll at one of the schools. That's how both of us became college football fans, is that we enrolled at schools that cared about college football and were able to enjoy it and fall in love with it. Well, if all of a sudden only 23 of these teams matter, well, you've just cut off the greatest way that you have to actually build fans in this sport. And I think that when you talk about television providers, they're just like, well, this is perfect. It is Rob Manfred, the commissioner of the MLB, the other day was asked about fans in Oakland who are athletics fans and what they're supposed to do now that the Athletics might just move to Las Vegas. And he said, well, the Giants are also in this market, because he doesn't actually understand how sports works. And this is what college football is trying to ask us to do. They're trying to ask us to say, look, man, you went to TCU, but like, Texas isn't that far, right? Like, I know that you grew up hating Texas, that they're a rival of yours, that you want to beat them every single time. But have you considered that if your program doesn't matter, you should simply just roll your fandom into being a fan of the University of Texas and consolidate, because that's much easier for us to sell.
I agree that there's going to be that passionate group of fans that are going to be exactly that way. And I know you and I are on that, at least in terms of the knowledge of the sport. We're in that zone, and the type of people that would listen to this are folks who in that vein. But for the general public, do you think they really care where those inevitable 12 teams that fight for a championship each year came, how they got there? You know, it's because it's like, how are they? Because it's always the same, dozen teams, and maybe it'll change. We haven't seen. I mean, I'm a little more optimistic that we might see more variety, and certainly this last season we saw a little bit more variety with obviously Washington making it to the title game, but it's not like they hadn't been to the playoff before. TCU would have been the more interesting one. If TCU had just only raced to the top, I think that would have been that, and they did. They got all the way to the title game, obviously. But if it is, though, still the same dozen teams, I think the general public, do you think it's going to change their TV watching habits? I always wonder how much of that equation is in there. Like, the hardcore fans are going to be disappointed that, oh, man, Oregon State really doesn't have a shot at making the championship if it turns into these super elite programs or these super elite conferences pushing everybody out. But how will that affect the overall interest in the sport? I think that's another interesting kind of question in all of this. It's not one I'm thrilled about, to be honest, but I do wonder if we're talking about something that ultimately will have very little impact in the ultimate motivation for everyone that's making a decision, which sadly, again, is going to be finances.
Well, I think here's the question is, okay, just real quick, Bobak, you grew up in Southern California, right? And so for you, what is the pitch for you as somebody who did not grow up in college football to become a fan of Alabama instead of just being a fan of Justin Herbert, right? Like, what is the pitch that college football can make to you that's better than the pitch that the NFL can to be a casual fan? I don't see it. The quality of football is better at the NFL level, right? Like, the players are better. They stick with their franchises for longer. Also, by the way, if you are in Buffalo or if you're in Green Bay, any one of these small markets, the NFL has made it so that your team still actually has a chance to compete and get better and ultimately compete for a championship. What is the pitch if you don't have these ties to these schools or these places to root for one of these random schools that's far away from you instead of just following an NFL team?
Well, I think isn't that the problem, though? The NFL has exactly what you said, that ability to keep these small market teams relevant. College football's I don't think they'll ever have that. So there's going to be small schools that will never be relevant. So at that point, are we just sort of speeding past? Because, let's face it, people, even this, they've been complaining about the regular season, actually the non-conference regular season games not getting attendance. Even Alabama was famously struggling with some of their non-conference schedule and getting chided by the coach about not showing the students not really showing up for, and that, not like Saban was booking these games, but like that was kind of the problem. So are we seeing kind of a push towards what people were already interested in before? Because your next season, Texas and Washington play each other again. That's going to get a lot of interest. That's going to be a game people are going to circle. Now, I granted outside of college football might not be as interesting, but it's still a compelling matchup. I remember when USC and Texas had a home and home a few seasons ago, and I remember the Fox programming for that. I remember I had a friend who was a non-college football fan who I got to come with me to go see the game when it was in the Coliseum, and I sent him the Fox promo, and he's like, "What is this? This is crazy. They're acting like this is like a movie." I'm like, well, it's a big deal. It's a big game, and he enjoyed it. But I do grant that it is a little harder to get. He went to a D3 school, so we can, it's hard to get some of the neutrals into this.
Well, I think there's two pieces of this, right? One is if Texas plays Auburn every year, is that actually a big game? Like, at what point does Auburn just become Iowa, right? Like, at what point does Auburn just become, whatever, right? Like, I think that there's a point where you devalue your brands, and everybody, I mean, I think especially in the SEC, the Big Ten, it's kind of like, it's actually going to, I think, work out in a funny way because you have such haves and have-nots in the Big Ten. The SEC all believes that they're haves. Like, every single one of them believes that they are just one step away from actually just being a championship team. And so what happens? Again, this is a very advantaged program, but what happens when Florida is a constant 11th place team? Does that devalue the entire brand of the University of Florida? Right? Like, do people look at that and all of a sudden, USC fans were probably like, well, we have to play Arizona or, whatever it is, or Texas fans being like, well, we, our best matchup is West Virginia. That sucks. Well, like, at what point does it devalue the actual brands that are in those leagues? Because if you lose perpetually, like, I think that impacts things quite a bit. The other thing too is, you live in a Big Ten town, right? Like, not one of the major ones, but how much does it impact students at the school in town that they play major football against major teams? And how much does that introduce people to college football, even though it's not necessarily that team that's winning?
Let me tell you, I teach at the University of Minnesota, and it strikes me how little most guys pay attention to the football team. I'm always like the weird
law
one.
school's
I'm the
not
professor,
the same. Law school's
and
not
I'm
the
the weird
same.
one. I'm
Law
like,
school's
hey,
not
do you
the
guys hear
same.
about the game? What game? Oh. I never in my wildest dreams that I figure I'd be in that position as a faculty member. But that said, I just want to ask kind of, it's interesting to see in all of this. Obviously, Florida State, no one seems to be having too much trouble with the fact that they're willing to make a deal with a rumor deal. And we've seen the numbers kind of bandied out there from some of the presentations to do 9 figures with a private equity group in order to potentially buy their way out of the ACC and potentially revamp their way they make money. But one issue I did want to ask you about, and this is, what's your view on the introduction of helmet communication? And it sounds like I'm going in sideways, but it is somewhat related. I mean, do you think it should be introduced? And is it important if it's done kind of uniformly, or if teams just do it as they can afford it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I would want to have it legislated at the conference level. Like, I think that if Alabama's playing Akron and Alabama has helmet communication and Akron can't afford it, that's not that big a deal to me. But like, if Alabama's playing LSU and now again, afford shouldn't be a consideration. Like, if Liberty is playing against New Mexico State, and Liberty obviously is willing to throw money at football in a way that a state university in New Mexico probably can't, like, that is a pretty crazy difference, right? Whenever you're talking about a conference mate, if it is conference wide, like if Liberty, can't use it against their conference mates where they're competing and it's kind of supposed to be on the same level, I think that that's fine, right? Like, I think that if some schools in college football and some conferences have it and some don't, it's not the end of the world. Now, I will be curious, and I mean, I haven't seen the numbers, I haven't run the numbers on this. Like, I don't think that for schools that play, especially power conference football, I can't imagine that that's going to be a heavy lift to add a couple of radios to helmets. We'll kind of see what it ends up being. Again, maybe it is something that the MAC can't afford, or the Mountain West, or the Sun Belt. But I do think that as long as this stuff is generally conference driven, it's not a huge deal to me. And I do also say on that point, I probably would want to see symmetry in postseason and college football playoff, right? Like, if Alabama is able to run out and, Tulane is in the playoff and they don't have helmet communications, that's a pretty huge unfair advantage when you're talking about like a playoff game. But ultimately, I don't think it's the hugest deal.
So what do you think happens in that situation? Do they tell Alabama, sorry, you have to switch off your helmets if you're playing a playoff game? And how's that going to go over? I mean, you think Greg Sankey's going to be like, oh yeah, totally. Oh yeah, Alabama, switch them off. Or I mean, because the only reason I bring it up is because I've heard sports advocates talking about the way where in the same sentence or in the same show, they'll be talking about how much they decry the money going into these conferences. And then I literally heard two people having that conversation, then immediately shift to, yeah, not everyone will be able to get TV, sports communications, but it's great that we're having them. And part of me, I'm like, wait, that could be a huge burden on some of these programs. But I think it's that kind of it's that, and that isn't a severe disconnect. I'm not trying to cast you over the flames on this, but I think to me that's the disconnect I have a lot of trouble with, because I think we are inevitably going to see this separation. We're going to see programs that just can't make it. I mean, at this point with this new college football playoff, it's not like, again, realistically UMass and UConn weren't going to be able to make it before. Only Notre Dame was the independent team that seemed like it had a real shot at making it into the playoff. But I mean, but with this at-large system, I mean, unless they have some stellar schedule that they went out in, it's just not realistic at this point. And at the same time, it puts a little less pressure on them. And maybe that's what some of these programs need. And maybe this move to super conferences is because, I mean, the only results in my mind, or at least what we're heading towards, is we're going to have these super conferences create perhaps their own league. Maybe Charlie Baker's is trying to keep the NCAA relevant in all of this, and I respect what he's trying to do. I think it was great. It was a very interesting proposal. We'll see where it goes, but I think perhaps equally as realistic, we're going to see the strategic partnership of the SEC and Big Ten come up with its own entity, and they'll invite whichever programs want to come over, because it sidesteps the other big issue, which is what would happen if the players become employees, because that's the big fear. The football players become employees. You almost want to separate them from the rest of the athletic department so that you don't have to pay the entire athletic department and all of those other athletes at the same level you're playing potentially the football players, because that wouldn't necessarily be ruinous, but it will certainly put some of the smaller sports into the crosshairs. Because the alternative to this scenario, the alternative to where I think we're headed in that direction is we have the NCAA, which is toothless at this point. Like literally anything. I love the other day Charlie Baker said, like, we're not going to even try to challenge transfer rules anymore. They're just like, we're tired of being beaten up. Just like, fine, just transfer wherever you want. We're good. Federal regulation is like the Hail Mary that keeps getting thrown out there, which it's always by people who seem to have never followed politics in their lives, or at least congressional politics, to know that nothing ever comes out of it. It's like meeting after meeting. There's no momentum for this. Nobody's going to spend their political capital to fight it over. And you could have some irony that the people that are most asking for federal regulation are the ones that don't want federal regulation in any other part of their lives. And no. But for football, we absolutely want the feds to regulate this. And then we have, of course, the other flip side of it is we have to not ignore the fact that we have, and I apologize to bring up all these huge macro level topics, but they all integrate with each other. The idea of the NIL and the portal, because those two also trouble folks. But realistically, the only way to control that is to is to make the players employees and create something like a pro league where you have a collective bargaining agreement and kind of create the regulations that the NFL has that keeps players from not necessarily bolting midseason or creates that level of control. I think we're heading in directions like that, but I just don't know if it's something we should decry. And I think that's the problem I have with it. I think I just don't understand why people would want to stop it at this point. Because any argument I've heard about stopping the changes that are happening, usually people like to circle it on the players because it's easier to circle on the players. I don't know why they're always kind of like the scapegoat for all of this. Like, oh, the players are going to start moving anywhere they want. They're going to start they're making all this money. And it reeks of a certain level of paternalism that I have some trouble with. I don't know. It's like the players aren't your kid. The players aren't your dog. You don't get to tell them where they get to go, what they have to do. If you're going to treat them like grown-ups, you got to eventually probably make them employees. It's almost patrician. And, like the aristocratic view of like, you almost imagine old British people like in a room, in their suits with pipes and monocles talking about, the what to do about these factory workers that want rights, when they just let them work the steam engine, and eventually maybe a couple of them will be ground up in the gears, but the progress will move forward. I just don't think realistically the old system works. And I think the new system that we're going to get is there are going to be haves. There are going to be have-nots. And it's just the nature of capitalism. And I'm not sure what people want an alternative. I mean, I kind of the reason I even mentioned Bosworth at the beginning was because he had that whole thing about the NCAA are communists and all that stuff. I'm like, fine. If you're against them because they're regulatory and they're controlling and you don't like this authoritarian entity above you, I don't think you can have any kind of regulatory agency beyond the conferences. You're going to have contracts. You're going to have, dollar amounts, rules that these entities make amongst themselves. And it's going to be kind of a free market system. And that free market system, if you're going to embrace that alternative, you have to embrace the good with the bad. And I think the bad, and I put that a little bit in quotes, is some programs may need to move down or figure out a revamp of how they even view football. And some are going to benefit and be able to kind of, I don't want to say transcend or go up to the next level, but they're going to be able to then pursue this more pro model and perhaps eke towards this semi-pro version of sports that seems to be what some people fear, but where we're headed. And really where we're headed, college football's always been semi-pro sports. College football's always been the reason. I mean, by the way, did you hear this? I'm just going to say the parallel in NBA that they're talking about getting rid of that G League team. I forgot what they call it, but the Ignite. Yeah, they're going to get rid of it because they're thinking about getting rid of it because NIL has made it pointless. It's like the whole point is now they can get compensated back in college. This was made for the guys who are not going to be able to, So I mean, is that where we're headed? Is college football just embracing what it's always been, and will it move to just be the semi-pro league or the minor leagues of the NFL?
Well, I think where I'd push back is that it is not new for there to be haves and have-nots. Like I mentioned, I went to a school that is a relative have-not. You went to a school that is a relative have. And for most of college football history, we've been able to live with this dichotomy, to live with not everybody playing on the same level. I think there are steps that could be taken to mitigate it a little bit, but I think ultimately the issue is not that some places have money and some don't. It's not that we are in a capitalistic system. It's that we are in a late capitalistic system where it's not just about having more and getting more. It's about flexing your more so that you can bleed everybody else dry and consolidate it under your umbrella. We are moving to a point where essentially people want there to be like a singularity. The thing that I always say, I brought this up last year. People are always like, well, oh, you're just afraid to play this team. No, we just like don't think that there's any benefit to it. Well, like ultimately, if you are not this past year the University of Michigan, there was downside to playing every single game on your schedule. And so, like, do we want a situation where every single thing about this sport moves under one umbrella? What does that mean? One, I mean, if we want to keep talking economically and in capitalistic terms, what does that mean for the consumer? What does that mean about what we're putting out? What does that mean in terms of customer acquisition? Because all of a sudden, if there's a small group of ways to enter the marketplace, well, then that means that there's a lot of other ways to enter the marketplace that are ultimately going to be cut out. And so it's not just the fact that Alabama has more money than Akron. We are all aware of that. We all know that. It is not a big deal. What's the problem is that Alabama and, not just Alabama, but Ohio State and Georgia and LSU and Texas and USC, they can't just live with having more. They have to make sure that everybody else has even less. And that is not a system that needs to exist. We don't need to try to bleed Miami of Ohio dry for Alabama fans to be able to enjoy their football team. It's just that's not how it has to work. And so ultimately, we are in a system, in a situation where to take a step back, no one is in charge. No one is in charge of making sure that the good of college football is taken care of. I made reference earlier to the NFL, where if you are a fan in Buffalo, New York, you don't have to think, well, what's the point of being a fan here? Because we're in Buffalo. How are we supposed to compete with LA? Because there is a system in place to ensure that they are creating a product that is adequate and that is competitive and that there is hope for. And despite the fact that the Chicago Bears make it look impossible to ever do anything good, you have a chance every single year in the NFL because you have the draft, because you have revenue, because you have a salary cap. I'm not saying that college football needs to go all the way to that model, but if you bleed everybody else dry in hopes of consolidating into a singularity, ultimately you destroy any reason for people to care about your sport. And it might not sound like a big deal now when we're just playing the hits, we're just putting the two helmets by each other. But again, all of a sudden, if you get to the SEC and Florida's in 11th place, well, Florida's not Florida anymore. Auburn's not Auburn anymore. Michigan or Penn State or Oregon or any one of these teams might not be what they are now anymore. Part of the value of these helmet games is that they are scarce. It's that Penn State and Auburn never play. It's that that USC is going to have a chance to play Ohio State, and that's going to be exciting the first time. If you're doing it every single year, then it just ultimately devalues the product and it devalues the brands, and we're going to end up in a situation where you have destroyed any reason for almost anybody to actually care about this sport.
To be fair, I don't think the last 3 years devalued Michigan, Ohio State year after year with those matchups that they were having.
But Michigan played 2 games all year that everybody tuned into in the regular season. They knew that there was the one big game, and they knew that there was the other game that's going to be a good test for them in Penn State. If every single one of the 12 games that they played on their schedule was a quote-unquote helmet program, then like at what point do you not care? At what point does it not matter? Now, again, like Michigan Ohio State is a long-term rivalry where these two sides care a lot about each other. We are getting rid of those things in the interest of more quote-unquote helmet games, right? We are getting rid of teams that have played each other and that care about each other and have strong opinions about each other. We're getting rid of Oklahoma State so that Oklahoma has a chance to play South Carolina instead. And maybe South Carolina is a better helmet than Oklahoma State. I don't even really know at this point, but that is clearly not a trade-off that's going to help the fans of either one of those teams or the state of Oklahoma or the sport at large.
I do have to say, though, I do blame the programs involved in the end of Bedlam more than I do the conferences, only because Clemson and South Carolina still managed to play. Obviously, USC and Notre Dame have never been in a conference together. It was a civil war, and the Apple Cup appear that they're going to both be going on again. So it could have been done.
But what I'd push back on that is after the collapse of the Southwest Conference, TCU and SMU played basically every single year up to this point. Now they're trying to get rid of it because of I don't even want to get into that right now. It pisses me off. But when these programs aren't considered peers anymore, it devalues the game, right? If TCU is a quote unquote power team and SMU is a quote unquote not power team, well, like you don't get to care about it the same way. I'm not saying they have to be in the exact same conference, but Clemson and South Carolina in the context of college football are peer programs. Florida and Florida State are peer programs. It is not going to hit the same when Oregon and Oregon State play in a couple of years when they're not peers, when Oregon is at a different level, quote unquote, when they're viewed in a different way. Like people are not going to be able to watch that game the same. It's not going to have the same impact on college football as it did when these programs are peers.
You know, one thing that is going to be a deciding factor in all of this, it's hard to predict, is how the market reacts. And the market reacting is the viewership. So we'll be seeing how this works. Do we see more viewers on a week-to-week basis for these so-called helmet games? More than the first season. You have to give it a couple of seasons to know whether that's working or not. I'll acknowledge that. Absolutely. I expect a spike this first season, no matter what. Just like the first time there was a CFP, those ratings were just through the roof. But at the same time, we'll see how they last in the long run and whether or not people still tune into the playoff if it starts to become a little too exclusive, if they change it. I think, again, this 12-team playoff we have right now is actually the most accessible of all time. So you could argue the market worked. Look at this. Now we have an accessible playoff. But that I think is the ultimate factor is, do these conferences move in such a way where they create a product that increases the number of people watching? I'm curious to see that. It's a big question. It was a good conversation. I enjoyed all of this. So, I think that's a good point to wrap this up. We could keep going on this for ages and really get into some of the some of the weeds on this. I just wanted to take a second to thank all of you for listening us to here at the College Football Survivor Show. I wanted to thank our podcast, Joey Aliberti, and thank, of course, my co-host, Shehan J. Raja. This is, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great week.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.